Good morning. I want to add my welcome to Sharon's and Eleanor's. It's such a pleasure to see old friends and also to meet some new people. And one of the new people who I'm especially excited about bringing into this community of practice is Kate Clancy, because she has been a pioneer of systems thinking in food systems and trying to understand how to apply that in different ways. You have a biography of Kate online, but since some of you don't have your laptops with you and you don't have that information right in front of you, I'm going to give you just the first few lines of Kate's bio. It's a very impressive bio. She's currently a food systems consultant. She's also a visiting scholar at the Center for a Livable Future at Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health. She's an adjunct professor at Tufts University, a senior fellow in the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture at University of Minnesota. She earned a doctorate in nutrition at the University of California, Berkeley. So she's coming to food systems work out of nutrition. One of the interesting things is that many of us are approaching food systems from different angles. For instance, systems ecology in my case. And let me just say that add two things onto that very short introduction. When I was teaching a course at Tufts in the Agriculture, Food, and Environment program in another life on the New England food system, I invited in about 6 different scholars who had a lot of expertise on food systems to try to introduce to my graduate students what food systems were all about, what the advantages were of thinking in that way. And Kate was the first person I thought of. I brought her up to Tufts for a week, and she gave several presentations, taught the class, kind of accompanied us on that journey of trying to better understand and analyze the New England food system. And I still regret we didn't publish a book out of those experiences, because they were all really good perspectives on the New England food system. And let me just say one other thing, that Kate is writing a regular column for the Journal of Food Systems, Agriculture, Food Systems, and Community Development on systems. So you might want to catch that. It's always interesting, and it'll give you some new insights. So Kate.
Thank you so much, Molly. Very nice. And I remember that time at Tufts, and it was early days of AFE. That was great. You guys don't remember that. You weren't there yet. Yes, I am. So again, my thanks to Eleanor and Sharon and Aaron. It's just a delight to be here. I couldn't make it last year, otherwise I would have been here. And I'm really pleased to be able to have the opportunity to talk to you about EFSNI, which is the project called Enhancing Food Security in the Northeast through Regional Food Systems. And as I start, I want to point out that there's a group of us in the room who are all working on this project. They were in the room. There they are, which includes, obviously, Chris Peters here, and then Nicole Titchener, who was at Tufts doing her doctorate and was part of the EFSNI project, and 2 people from Center for a Livable Future, Rachel Santo and Karen Bassarab in the back, who have also been part of the project. So our region is a different one, as Tom already pointed out. Our region is the entire Northeast, and that is the 12 Northeast states from Maine to West Virginia and the District of Columbia. This map shows you the sites of our institutions, and I'll have another slide on that in a minute, 11 of them, as well as the location of the low-income communities in which we are working on this project. And they're scattered throughout. Where we were working in specific low-income communities had a lot to do with where our faculty, where the researchers lived, and where their institutions were. But we have a pretty good array of metropolitan and rural study sites. The orienting goal is here. And this actually was a goal we wrote a little while after we received the funding from USDA to do the project. So the orienting goal, and this is a long-term goal, is to assess whether greater reliance on regionally produced foods can improve food access for low-income communities while also benefiting farmers, other firms in food supply chains, and others in the food system, meaning anybody who's touched by food. This is a goal that all of us kind of learned by heart. We repeated it often enough, and it does in a way frame the project. We are not an intervention project. In that sense, we're not an action project either. We're a big systems project. We think of what we're doing as kind of a blueprint for the future, and or a way to do a very good piece of a lot of strategic planning that people might want to be doing in the region. And think about how to bring the idea and the reality of a larger regional food system to fruition. And already a lot of those pieces have started to happen. Here are the institutions that are a part of us. We have 2 1890 universities, 3 1862 universities, 3 private universities, which has been a delight to mingle the land grants with the privates. We have 2 USDA agencies, ERS and ARS, as well as 1 nonprofit, which is the Northeast Sustainable Ag Working Group, NESOG. And so we have all worked very closely together. We are in the 7th year of this project, which is kind of unheard of for a research project. But USDA came to us in the 7th year and said, please apply for a year 7 extension. We really like what you're doing. So we were happy to do that. We work at a larger regional level. This is the region that's defined by USDA for its rural development work. It's the region that NESOG has defined as its region many years ago. So there are many, many things to say about regional, but I'm only going to mention 4 of them that come out of the original paper that Kathy Roof and I did in 2010 called It Takes a Region. And we look at the dimensions of food supply as the starting points, especially taking into account, if you want to look at the food supply for a larger population, the total caloric and nutritional needs of that population in the region are very high, very, very high. The natural resource base, of course, is incredibly important, critical in determining how much and what kinds of foods can be produced in any region. The availability of land and land use decisions are very critical there, so is water. Economic development proceeds with multiple markets, new business models, and trade. In order to build a stronger regional food system, we need new business economic models. We need new ideas of how trade occurs. And we obviously always need multiple markets. And the products can be, and all those products can be differentiated by place and other attributes. And then diversity, especially biodiversity, is one of the key components that we always keep in mind. Biodiversity will tend to be greater, kind of almost by definition, not completely, in a larger region, especially like the Northeast, which crosses a number of latitudes. And we feel like in terms of building a strong regional food system, all those latitudes are important, going, like I said, from the tip of Maine to the tip of West Virginia. Greater biodiversity, as you all know, also supports resilience, and talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So here's an organizational chart of our project. There are 6 teams here. We actually have 3 other teams, an administrative team, an evaluation team, and a kind of do-everything team. And as you look at this, just 2 things. For something I'm going to talk about much later, for those of you who know some of the people on this slide, the teams themselves have a lot of different disciplines in them. The teams are not made up of people from a single discipline. We also had a wonderful advisory board, including Rob King from Minnesota and Tony LaQuarrie, and with Food Focus, and Dave Marvell, who's the head of the Fruit and Vegetable Association of Delaware, and Joyce Smith, who is one of the most extraordinary community organizers par excellence in Southeast Baltimore. So that's what we look like on a piece of paper. The emphasis of the project was obviously on food security. The funding came from the first year of the USDA's AFRI Global Food Security Grant Program, the CAP grants, the large grants that they gave for the first time that year. And what we did from the very beginning, and it's become more and more important to understand that we did this, was we took two of the multiple definitions of food security and melded them. So these two definitions of food security we kind of look at all the time in our low-income areas, in the rural areas, et cetera. And that is this first one, the original definition, says FAO 1981. That's when they got around to codifying it. It really comes out of the 40s, the 1940s. And then community food security. So those two definitions of food security are what we're looking at throughout the project. This is not our graph. It's Polly Erickson's. I use it all the time. Every time I look at it more closely, it's even more intelligent and captures most of the components of food security. It's really excellent, and I will say that we certainly didn't look at all of the things that are on this table, but we did a lot of them. Chris is nodding his head, yeah. We did in fact look at quite a number of them in the project. We decided, we did the melding of the food security definitions in essence because, as Polly Erickson has said, the primary outcome of every food system is food security. At whatever level it exists, theoretically, its reason is for that everybody gets fed well. We recognize that populations in low-income areas also, with our emphasis on low-income areas, we recognize that those populations don't exist in a vacuum. I keep pointing out, farmers don't grow food just for low-income people. Farmers grow food for everybody. And then the rest of the supply chain and policy and power and all kinds of things that Tom just talked about have everything to do with where the food ends up and who has access to it. So going into the future, kind of the project feels that we need to keep addressing food security for low-income folks, along with food security for everybody, especially if you think about climate change and a whole lot of other things that are perhaps person in the Oval Office might be one of those other things and stuff like that. So anyway, the next slide I want to show you are our framing questions. We developed these questions a little bit later in the project under Chris's leadership. And so these are long-term strategic questions that people have to ask themselves. And we needed this in order to be able to feel like we really knew where the whole group of 22 senior researchers plus a cast of thousands was heading in the project, and what was really underlying things that we didn't put in the proposal to USDA, but what were we really thinking about in terms of a long-term kind of almost strategic plan for ourselves with these framing questions. So what is the Northeast food system? We start to answer that. Is food sufficiently accessible? We know the answer already, but we start to get at a lot of the pieces of that. How might the Northeast food system respond to future challenges and opportunities? We have a lot of research that goes to that question. What changes would be required in key elements? We have a lot of research that starts to go to that question, as well as along with also a lot of policy issues and questions that we will eventually get around to. So here is one of the major components of the project. This is our market basket. We had people, you'll see, from so many different disciplines and so many different teams that a market basket of foods was one of the ways of bringing everybody to focus on the same set of items, and from multiple with different kinds of research questions, very different kinds of research methodology, really different thoughts around both, obviously, biology as well as sociology and everything in between. So this market basket became the center of a lot of what we did. And what the market basket has, obviously, foods that represent major food groups, both processed and fresh. Most of these foods have been, in the past or present, produced or processed in the Northeast. Okay? We could do a whole seminar, I will at some time, on the market basket. So anyway, that was a very important piece. This is the first major kind of collaborative effort we all took to bring this together. Why a systems lens? Social, economic, and biophysical systems are linked. I mean, that's systems 101. Pieces drive systems behavior that can't be understood considering them separately, and boy, did we find that out in our work. And systems approaches to food access that pointed out a long time ago may be more cost-effective and sustainable in terms of not just targeting one neighborhood, but looking more systemically across lots of different low-income areas. We took, at least I took, and other people who had read these were there in wanting to take up the challenge of the NRC report towards sustainable agricultural systems in the 21st century, to do transformative research, and also, let's see, we here in this statement, it kind of argues for looking at this for production, but it's very clear that this applies to every part of the supply chain and other parts of the food system that aren't the supply chain, that you need to look at improving the sustainability of every part of the food system, not just production. Applying this to food security, which is the result of multiple factors such as globalization and poverty and racism and of concomitant market failures. We have a lot of ag economists in our project. We see it, it's clearly a wicked problem, and only one for which a systems approach makes good sense. So this is, I just put this in. This is the IOM, the more recent IOM report on a framework for assessing effects of the food system. This is the food systems graph we came up with in that report, and it's also very good. I mean, it has a supply chain going through it, but it's very clear that the supply chain is not just the food system. And then in the same study, this framework concept and what the report is suggesting that all researchers should be doing at any level, at a community level, at any level, and they don't have to be academic researchers. Everybody should be aware of how critical it is to look at multiple domains at the same time, at least to have them in mind, even if you can't work on all of them. Multiple domains are really important, and then there's a lot of other systems concepts in that concept. So now I want to move into how the project used much of what I've just gone through, very more specifically in terms of the kind of research that we ended up doing. And this is, so applying the domains from the IOM report to EFSNI, just what I'm going to, in the next 6 or 7 slides, I'm going to present a few key examples of things that we did, but there are hundreds across the whole project. I mean, there's many, many more, just a few keys here. So with regard to the environmental domain, it wasn't a real strong focus, but we ended up doing a lot. We looked at land use for food and feed production, very sophisticated models of that. And we developed models, and part of us developed models which predict corn, wheat, and potato production changes under different climate change scenarios. And I'll talk a little bit about one of those a little bit later. Under the economic domain, the distribution team studied full supply chains of the market baskets, of 2 market basket items in each of the 15 stores that we worked in. Those folks analyzed the margins of everybody in the supply chain and other elements of each part of the chain. The consumption team did several projects, including analyzing the prices of the market basket foods in our stores. We did the pricing 3 different times over 5 years, and we have huge amounts of data. And they also did a secondary data analysis of a national data set that's only available through the Economic Research Service to look at the purchases of our market basket items by low-income and non-low-income households. And that sample for the Northeast is over 3,000 households, so that's a nice size sample. With regard to the social domains, obviously we were focused on low-income communities, so that grounded us in thinking about social concerns. Some examples of what we did there was we utilized many ways, many different methods, and many different face-to-face ways to understand the issues of food access, very complicated issues of food access. Obviously an emphasis on low-income communities. We did focus groups, we did intercept surveys outside of the stores. We did a community readiness study, which in the 5 of our locations where we did community readiness, people were very interested in what we were getting and sharing with them. We used program participation basically as a surrogate for income for the project. We couldn't ask an income question in a 5-minute survey outside of a supermarket. Okay, so we didn't. So we are not saying that just because somebody participates in a program that makes them low income, but it comes pretty close. And we also then looked at the food environment, 2 kinds of food environments. We looked at the food environment in the stores, what the stores are like, their cleanliness, their lighting, their all kinds of stuff. We also looked at the food environment. We also asked a lot of questions about the food environment in neighborhoods and of people living there and saying, what do you think about it? We also at the same time asked them what did they know about local and regional, and so all of this was quite interesting. In the health domain, we didn't do a lot there. We were already doing so much that we didn't say that we would do a lot around healthier foods, but we did, in fact, have healthy versions of foods in the market basket, and we also, with both big data sets, the secondary and our own data sets, were able to analyze purchasing by and comparing low-income and non-low-income and comparing urban and rural populations and both together. So we have multiple kinds of analyses of what low-income people are purchasing in rural areas of our market basket foods and other things like that. So then there are other systems concepts that I did this. This is some of the new stuff that a lot of my colleagues haven't seen yet. So I told Chris that he has to pay really close attention and tell me what I'm getting wrong. But there are lots of other characteristics of systems and systems science and systems thinking that also are part of the project. One of them is where you start, and that's you have to define a boundary for where you're working. I've given you our geographic boundary and why we think that this large region, particularly in the Northeast, is a really excellent way to be looking at things because of the population density, because of the amount of farmland that is in each state, which is extremely variable. You New England folks really know that. And environmental conditions. And again, I've mentioned latitudes, but latitudes encompass where the water is, where the viable land, arable land is, many other things, and then including other health issues in inner cities and all that. So the other big question, and it's something that people have written some about, Kathy and I wrote a lot about, the marketing infrastructure in the whole Northeast region and how what exists now, what used to exist, which is a whole lot more than we have now. In the 1970s, just as I got to New York State, the infrastructure, food infrastructure in the Northeast started to disappear, and been following it ever since. So another systems concept is scale, and By definition, you can tell the project is working at a somewhat larger scale. As we've done these intensive supply chain studies, it's been so clear to us that supply chain actors exist. You already know that, but when you really get into it and draw the diagrams and talk to everybody, it just really comes home. The supply chain actors exist across all scales, from local to global, and most supply chains embody local to global. I mean, we know that, but a lot of attention has been paid to alternative supply chains where it's all local maybe, but most people get their food from a much larger supply chain. And we cannot ignore that. And what we wanted to do in our work is to study a lot more what do those bigger supply chains look like in reality, on the ground, in low-income areas throughout the region. Resilience, a long-term goal, again, and resilience is reached in part by understanding that scales are nested inside of each other. We all know that. But the part that I've taken away from all of my reading on resilience is the scales have to always be communicating with each other. We're doing a lousy job of that in most projects, of not being aware, if you're working at a local level, of not being aware of what's going on in the larger regional level around you. And we need to do all this networking. We feel like we've really done it inside the project, which at one point had about 90 people working on it. We've really built that kind of network across multiple states and multiple disciplines and communicated with each other all the time. But that's one of our lessons, is that you really have to keep doing that. And then the last thing is the RSR is work that people did in the production team. It means regional self-reliance. It's a proportion. It's in an article that Tim was on the team that did all this more enormous work to calculate basically the proportion of the food produced in the region against the proportion of food needed in the region. And it's a net balance, but it doesn't say that anything about where the food is eaten. A lot of food is exported out of the region, but it tells you, for example, that for potatoes, I believe, 38%, we have an RSR in the whole Northeast region of 38, which means that all it means is 38. It doesn't mean we need to import 62% of the rest of the potatoes. It's just this net balance figure. But it's a really interesting place to start thinking about what else we need to know. Then another systems concept, heterogeneity. This project is mainly totally heterogeneous. The stores, they're all supermarkets, but they're not convenience stores. They're all supermarkets, but they all look completely different. And they function very differently in their areas. We have a lot of heterogeneity in terms of urban and rural communities, and urban and rural land masses, and what supply chains look like in urban and rural areas. I mentioned we do a lot of low income and non-low income comparisons on not just purchases of food, but where people shop, and learning really interesting things about that. And then a lot of heterogeneity in the supply chain actors, a lot of very different kinds of relationships of store owners with wholesalers, and wholesalers with producers, and all those kinds of things that now we're starting to tease out, and it helps us figure out how we're going to work, what we do next in terms of how do we get more Northeast regionally produced food into those stores. The other part of studying systems is to use different methods or things, and I'm just going to show you two. We did a lot of modeling, and I chose these particular models because they also represent another real key food systems concept, which is adaptation. Okay, So in the potato model, those folks looked at yield losses for potatoes over the next 30 years under climate change conditions using the international climate change data. And then, and it's a disaster. I mean, it's with no adaptation. We hardly have any potatoes left in the Northeast, which is one of the major potato growing areas. But the reason to do that is to show people what it looks like if you don't adapt, and then to start talking about how are the farmers going to go about adapting. Earlier planting dates, new varieties, more irrigation. We're going to get more rain than some parts of the country. I mean, that kind of thing. So you can do that with it. In the cabbage model, what the shock to the system in the cabbage model was to increase the demand for cabbage. And sometimes people laugh because they know that cabbage consumption is going down, but I still hold out and Tom does too, of course, being Irish. Oh yes, and these are the Irish foods, the potatoes and the cabbage. You laugh, but the reason potatoes are in there is partly because I wouldn't let them go out. Thank God that Dave Fleischer at ARS was doing the climate change work. When I called him up when we were figuring this out, and asked him, what are you doing any vegetable in a climate change model? Guess what he said the vegetable was? Potatoes. I said, okay, it's in. Anyway, so they looked at where the increased production across the country might occur if we increase cabbage demand. A bunch of it can be in season in New York. All right, so that's we can find out things there. And then also in the stores, with regard to adaptation, we chose 3 of our stores as model stores. Their business models, when we started really look at what they were doing, it was all ways of adapting to a changing climate for dollar stores and things, and really screwing them up. And so they're adapting in really fascinating ways. Let me go back. And yes, and then the project is here because I won't go into it. It's there's lots of fun stories. It was constantly under adaptive management, this project. We took out things, we put in things, people left. We did constant renewal of the project to keep us online. I had to keep telling them, it's okay. USDA is not going to come after us if we don't do something that was in the proposal we wrote in 2010. And then the last thing was the schemo team, which Chris led. It's a scenarios and modeling team. We had multiple people doing models in the project. None of them were the same models. Needed to have a way of integrating them, bringing them together, talking together. So we did that. The other piece of strategies was to look at supply chains. Supply chains are a part of food systems. They're not a food system. They're a part of it. We did multiple measurements. We looked at the store viability multiple ways, and we also did this urban, peri-urban, rural analyses that Michael Connor did out of Columbia. Have you seen it? Yeah, it's fabulous. It's fabulous. And it just is a whole different way of thinking about what they did is they used multiple data sets and mapped where every component of the food system is in 5 different zones across the whole Northeast region. And with 5 cities in particular, Baltimore being one of them. And it turns out that there's an enormous infrastructure left, especially in peri-urban areas in the Northeast, for processing and wholesaling and lots of other things. And that's going to be really useful in the future. This is a kaleidoscope of, as we were coming to, we were starting to put a lot of things together. I just had a kaleidoscope in my head of pulling all the pieces together and writing them up as a systems analysis. And so this is for the market basket paper. And just quickly, Chris and I will talk a lot about education for those people who are going to come to that workshop, but we also did an enormous amount of outreach and extension work throughout the project. The food system, we had a food system modeling learning community that we pulled together of modelers all over the United States who are modeling local and regional food systems, and we've worked together for 3 years now. The community local and regional food systems, CoP, started in our project. we thought we were supposed to do that, and then Jill Auburn later said, oh, you didn't have to. And I said, Jill, you made it very clear you wanted an ECOP out of this, so we got together with people at Wisconsin and Ohio State. It's now one of the largest ECOPs out there. And here is a meta image of the project. There's about 80 components there. And thanks to Michael Connard, it's really nice to have a designer on a project. So that I won't take any more time. I do want to just finish up with the fact that this was simultaneously or progressively a multi, an inter, and a transdisciplinary project. And so that basically AFNI contained elements of each disciplinarity with a trajectory to inter and trans. We got to inter a lot. We got to trans a little bit. Multidisciplinary being a project consisting of related fields and disciplines that the outcomes are kind of pulled together at the end. Interdisciplinary research that is not contained in a single discipline, and you do that through many things, which I'll show you in just a second. Transdiscipline, a distinct type of disciplinary research with its own knowledge, which arches over the disciplines. It's like an emerging property from, is how I've started to think about it. And so that was, we didn't know, Chris knew some. Most of us didn't know a whole lot about transdisciplinary when we started the project. We didn't start really looking at this until about year 5. And then it got really interesting. So here were our disciplines. The way, depending on how you count it, we have 13 to 15 or 16 or 17 different disciplines in the project. And I can tell you that every one of those disciplines in the embodiment of 1 or 2 people contributed greatly to the project. There was no slacking off anywhere here. And finally, almost finally, this ingredients of success it's for a transdisciplinary project, an interdisciplinary project, and we put this together for our national conference 2 years ago. And so these are the ingredients of success: leadership structure, cohesion among members, humor, discussion, spending time together, practicing trust, a lot of the things you had up, Tom. And then we actually we did all our own internal evaluation for the first 5 years. We had a bit of money left for evaluation, and we were able to hire an expert in transdisciplinary project evaluation, which was fabulous. And these are quotes from her evaluation of us. She talked to all the senior leaders. So, and this list, I mean, obviously I was looking at both of them at the same time, but this list is pretty similar to Joan Thompson's list that says, that she said we had a robust communication system, we were highly collaborative, we had inclusive decision making, we invited diversity, and the one in the bottom is the most important, an atmosphere of care and concern for the greater whole. Lots of wonderful, wonderful comments that came from our project members about loving this project, so that's cool. Some things we learned from the research, I'm not going to go through all of these. These are, again, I just picked and chose. We learned a lot about shoppers' understanding of local and regional. We didn't expect them to have much understanding of regional. And the interesting piece was the people who got regional immediately were immigrants. It was so clear to them why we would be talking about regional. We learned a whole lot about the fragility of independent supermarkets. I don't think anywhere near enough attention is being paid to those independent supermarkets, not the convenience stores, the supermarkets, in both rural and urban areas. We lost 4 stores over the course of the project, all for different reasons, but we didn't have a lot to begin with. The importance and amount of value added after production in supply chains, that's my new soapbox. There's been a huge amount of attention paid in research to what's going back to farmers and how much, if we support farmers, how much that adds to the regional economy. You have to be looking at going down the rest of the supply chain. We've got foods in our market basket that, by definition, there's almost none of the producers are in the Northeast region. But the amount of value added that's coming from wholesaling and retailing is huge. And we should be, again, not just paying more attention to that fact, but getting it out there and getting policymakers to be aware of how much is coming out of looking at. We also have many ways to increase production of foods in the region from those models. Some of the things you might do. We have Chris's food print work in the project, models of carrying capacity of the region under different dietary scenarios. And I want to acknowledge that Jennifer's part of that work. And the role that peri-urban areas play, and many, many, many other things. And then the last slide is some things we learned from the process besides what I just shared with you. How to work consistently and maintain cohesion with really lots of researchers, some of whom know each other, a lot of whom don't. How to encourage people to constantly reach outside their comfort zone, and they really did, especially the economists. The need for lots of face-to-face time, the need for many kinds of communication processes, the importance of multi-year funding. My gosh, we couldn't have done this without 5-year funding and then 2 extensions, which when we started the project were not legal. You couldn't get an extension for a 5-year project when we started, but we got one. And then what to do better next time. So that's kind of EFSMI in a nutshell.
So we can take one question, then we're going to take a break. The break will be upstairs in something called River. Do you want to just keep walking and you'll eventually get there? It's a beautiful spot. You'll know it when you see it. And then we'll reconvene here at 11:15. So that was wonderful. Let's take one question.
Thank you. Patty.
Thanks for that presentation. So interesting. So I'm just wondering about the market basket, and you talked about 2 criteria for the food that you chose. So representing main food groups and identifying processors and things. And I'm curious about what the limiting factors in terms of the number of foods you include in that.
Well, there was only one limiting factor, and it was either 7 or 8 foods. We had to have a market basket, a small enough basket that 22 people from different disciplines could get older and do what they needed to do in multiple venues, in models, inside supermarkets, in focus groups. We didn't do that so much. In the food camp work, in the regional South Carolina, which was originally done on all food groups, but then Tim ran and members were in for our market baskets. So we couldn't do it any more than 8 foods, and we would have been overwhelmed with the food on it. So that was the reason.
Why were no 9 foods?
We thought about that a lot, but there is not a huge legume production in the Northeast compared to many other parts of the U.S. We had to have one meat product, and of course we had to have dairy. We're in the Northeast, and so then the potatoes and the cabbage were pretty obvious, and we talked about almost every food you can imagine, Sharon, and we didn't do legumes. We kept saying, oh, for the next time we do something like this, we'll do legumes, we'll do chicken. We could have done chicken because of the Delmarva. I mean, this was a long conversation with a dozen people engaged in it. You can make, well, no, yes, you would have, yes. But we didn't focus on all kinds of sustainability. We focused on land use and climate change. We didn't focus on all kinds of diets. We focused on a diet that would be most present in low-income areas in the Northeast. Yeah. So, okay.